We're about to read The Prince with the Silver Hand, The Tale of the Eternal Champion, Volume 10 by Michael Moorcock. I want to make a note about pronunciations. I don't speak Gaelic, and I'm not familiar with the pronunciations. I've read the Tain Bow, and so I have some of the basics like Conquevor and Maeve and stuff like that. But the words that Michael Moorcock uses are references to those and are spelt quite differently. So, for example, the spelling of the word Maeve, as I understand it, is MEDB. There's a race in this book that uses that term for the name of their species, but I'm not going to call them mavens. That seems strange. I will try to be as faithful as possible to the intentions that I think that Michael Moorcock has in using these terms, although bounded within my strictly limited understanding of Gaelic pronunciations. I hope that you'll extend the generosity to me to imagine any errors or disagreements as simply mutations in our understanding of a story from another world. The Prince with the Silver Hand by Michael Moorcock. The Tale of the Eternal Champion, Volume 10. Dear reader, this second quorum sequence was perhaps even more influenced by Celtic myth than the first, and draws on images and ideas inspired by the Cuchulainn stories and other Irish tales of a time when the dark gods of Ireland were still abroad, threatening all we hold dear. It seems to me that there is a common thread of romance linking the old stories of gods and heroes with modern fantasy, satisfying the identical needs we share with our remote ancestors. In the old days, when we had less of a handle on the truth, we didn't bother too much about what was fiction and what was not, so long as it didn't involve us directly. We enjoyed the stories for their own sake, perhaps as readers of today's popular newspapers and magazines enjoy unlikely tales of the rich and famous. The main difference appears to be that people tended to wait until their subjects were safely dead or on the other side of an ocean before telling their stories, or else making sure that their version was a very flattering one. Now, I suppose it's presumptuous of me to wander into territory explored with far greater talent and profundity by half the great writers of Dublin. But the quorum stories are my acknowledgement of the huge debt I have to both the mythology and the modern literature of Ireland, especially Yeats. An almost forgotten Irish writer who gave me enormous pleasure as a boy was Charles Lever, who had much of Dickens' zest, his taste for the extraordinary, his talent for melodrama and extravagant comedy. A lively writer in the main. He wrote a 3-volume comedy in 1864, Cornelius O'Dowd, which is no longer very funny since it touches mainly on forgotten issues. His Dodd Family Abroad, however, written in 1854 with illustrations by Phiz, is still a minor comic masterpiece, and far superior in my view to his tales of army life with Harry Lorrequer or Charles O'Malley the Irish Dragoon, which made him famous and immensely popular in his day. I read Lever around the same time I was reading Harrison Ainsworth, whose tales of Dick Turpin and the Tower of London were also huge bestsellers once, and established the form of the historical romance we know today. These led me to darker stories by Lewis and Le Fanu and Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, perhaps the greatest of all Gothic extravaganzas. Oscar Wilde, when he left prison in 1897, took the name of Melmoth when he left to live abroad. We owe much that is good in imaginative literature to Irish writers. Swift, of course, being one, and Lord Dunsany, who gave us those marvellously witty fantasies like The Gods of Pagana and The Sword of Welleran, which were also part of my youthful reading, and which, together with the stories of James Branch Cabell and Fritz Leiber, made me realise that heroic fantasy could be both witty, elegant, and intelligent. This heroic fantasy, a somewhat rougher beast than Dunsany's, is dedicated to all those old hippies with whom I shared an honest track or two in a kind of golden Celtic afternoon some years ago. Nick Turner, Dave Brock, Terry Ollis, Hugh Lloyd Langton, Harvey Bainbridge, Simon House, Simon King, Pete Pavley, Graham Charnock, Bob Calvert, Adrian Shaw, Steve Gilmore, Lang Jones, Martin Griffin, Barney Bubbles, Martin Stone, and many others. When gods and heroes still knew how to have a damn good time. Yours, Michael Moorcock. The Bull and the Spear, for Marianne. Prologue. In those days there were oceans of light and cities in the skies and wild flying beasts of bronze. There were herds of crimson cattle that roared and were taller than castles. There were shrill viridian things that haunted bleak rivers. It was a time of gods manifesting themselves upon our world in all her aspects. A time of giants who walked on water, of mindless sprites, and misshapen creatures who could be summoned by an ill-considered thought, but driven away only on pain of some fearful sacrifice. Of magics, phantasms, unstable nature, impossible events, insane paradoxes, dreams come true, dreams gone awry, of nightmares assuming reality. It was a rich time and a dark time, the time of the sword rulers, the time when the Vadhag and the Nadrag, age-old enemies, were dying. The time when man, the slave of fear, was emerging. Unaware that much of the terror he experienced was the result of nothing else but the fact that he himself had come into existence. It was one of many ironies connected with man who, in those days, called his race Mabden. The Mabden lived brief lives and bred prodigiously. Within a few centuries they rose to dominate the westerly continent on which they had evolved. Superstition stopped them from sending many of their ships towards Vadhag and Nadrag lands for another century or two. But gradually they gained courage where no resistance was offered. They began to feel jealous of the older races. They began to feel malicious. The Vadhag and the Nadrag were not aware of this. They had dwelt 1,000,000 or more years upon the planet which now at last seemed at rest. They knew of the Mabden, but considered them not greatly different from other beasts, though continuing to indulge in their traditional hatreds of one another. The Vadhag and the Nadrag spent their long hours in considering abstractions and the creation of works of art and the like. Rational, sophisticated, at one with themselves. These older races were unable to believe in the changes that had come. Thus, as it almost always is, they ignored the signs. There was no exchange of knowledge between the two ancient enemies, even though they had fought their last battle many centuries before. The Vadhag lived in family groups occupying isolated castles scattered across a continent, called by them Bro an Vadag. There was scarcely any communications between these families, for the Vadhag had long since lost the impulse to travel. The Nadrag lived in their cities built on the islands in the seas to the northwest of Brochen Vadag. They also had little contact, even with their closest kin. Both races reckoned themselves invulnerable, and both were wrong. Upstart man was beginning to breed and spread like a pestilence across the world. This pestilence struck down the old races wherever it touched them, and it was not only death that man brought, but terror too. Willfully he made of the older world nothing but ruins and bones. Unwittingly he brought psychic and supernatural disruptions of a magnitude which even the great old gods failed to comprehend. And the great old gods began to know fear. And man, slave of fear, arrogant in his ignorance, continued his stumbling progress. He was blind to the huge disruptions aroused by his apparently petty ambitions. As well, man was deficient in sensitivity, had no awareness of the multitude of dimensions that filled the universe, each plane intersecting with several others. Not so the Vadhag or the Nadrag, who had known what it was to move at will between the dimensions they termed the 5 planes. They had glimpsed and understood the nature of many planes, other than the 5 through which the earth moved. Therefore, it seemed a dreadful injustice that wise races should perish at the hands of creatures who were still little more than animals. It was as if vultures feasted on and squabbled over the paralysed body of the youthful poet, who could only stare at them with puzzled eyes as they slowly robbed him of an exquisite existence that they would never appreciate, never know they were taking. If they valued what they stole, if they knew what they were destroying, says the old Vadhag in the story, The Only Autumn Flower, well, then I would be consoled. It was unjust. By creating man, the universe had betrayed the old races. But it was a perpetual and familiar injustice. The sentient may perceive and love the universe, but the universe cannot perceive and love the sentient. The universe sees no distinction between the multitude of creatures and the elements which comprise it. All are equal. None is favoured. The universe, equipped with nothing but the materials and the power of creation, continues to create. Something of this, something of that. It cannot control what it creates, and it cannot, it seems, be controlled by its creations, though a few might deceive themselves otherwise. Those who curse the workings of the universe curse that which is deaf. Those who strike out at those workings fight that which is inviolate. Those who shake their fists at blind stars. But this does not mean that there are not some who will try to do battle with and destroy the invulnerable. There will always be such beings, sometimes beings of great wisdom, who cannot bear to believe in an insouciant universe. Prince Coram Jalen Ursay. He was one of these. Perhaps the last of the Vadhag race. He was sometimes known as the Prince in the Scarlet Robe. This is the second chronicle concerning his adventures. The first chronicle, known as the Books of Coram, told how the Mabden followers of Earl Glendyth a Cray killed Prince Coram's relatives and his nearest kin, and thus taught the prince in the scarlet robe how to hate, how to kill, how to desire vengeance. We have heard how Earl Glendyth tortured Prince Coram and took away a hand and an eye, and how Coram was rescued by the giant of Lar and taken to the castle of the Margravine Raelina, a castle set upon a mount surrounded by the sea. Though Raelina was a Mabden woman, of the gentler folk of Luam and Esh, Coram and she fell in love. When Glendyth roused the pony tribes, the forest barbarians, to attack the Margravine's castle, she and Coram sought supernatural aid, and thus fell into the hands of the sorcerer Shul, whose domain was the island called Svi an Fanla Brul, home of the gorged god. And now Coram had direct experience of the morbid, unfamiliar powers at work in the world. Shul spoke of dreams and realities. "I see you are beginning to argue in Mabden terms," he told Coram. "It is just as well for you if you wish to survive in this Mabden dream." "Is it a dream?" said Coram. "Of sorts, but real enough. It is what you might call the dream of a god. Then again, you might say that it is a dream that a god has allowed to become reality. I refer, of course, to the Knight of the Swords who rules the Five Planes. With Raelina, his prisoner, Shul could make a bargain with Coram. He gave him 2 gifts, the Hand of Quill and the Eye of Rin, to replace his own missing organs. These jewelled and alien things were once the property of 2 brother gods known as the Lost Gods, since they mysteriously vanished. Armed with these, Coram began his great quest, which was to take him against all 3 sword rulers, the Knight, the Queen, and the King of the Swords, the mighty Lords of Chaos. And Coram discovered much concerning these gods, the nature of reality and the nature of his own identity. He learned that he was the champion eternal, that in 1,000 other guises, in 1,000 other ages, it was his lot to struggle against those forces which attacked reason, logic, and justice, no matter what form they took. And at last, at long last, he was able to overwhelm, with the help of a mysterious ally, those forces and banish gods from his world. Peace came to Bro an Varag, and Coram took his mortal bride to his ancient castle, which stood on a cliff overlooking a bay. And meanwhile, the few surviving Vadhag and Nadrag turned again to their own devices, and the golden land of Luam and Esh flourished and became the centre of the Mabden world, famous for its scholars, its bards, its artists, its builders, and its warriors. A great age dawned for the Mabden folk. They flourished, and Coram was pleased that his wife's folk flourished. On the few occasions when Mabden travellers passed near Castle Erawn, he would feast them well and be filled with gladness when he heard of the beauties of Halweg nan Vaik, capital city of Luam and Esh, whose walls bloomed with flowers all year round. And the travellers would tell Coram and Raelina of new ships which brought great prosperity to the land, so that none in Luam and Esh knew hunger. They would tell of the new laws which gave all a voice in the affairs of the country, and Coram listened, and was proud of Raelina's race. To one such traveller he offered an opinion. "When the last of the Vadag and the Nadrag have disappeared from this world," he said, "the Mabden will emerge as a greater race than ever we were." "Yeah, but we shall never have your powers of sorcery," answered the traveller, and he caused Coram to laugh heartily. "We had no sorcery at all. We had no conception of it. Our sorcery, it was merely our observation and manipulation of certain natural laws, as well as our perception of other planes of the multiverse, which we have now all but lost. It is the Mabden who imagine such things as sorcery, who would always rather invent the miraculous than investigate the ordinary, and find the miraculous therein. Such imaginations will make your race the most exceptional this earth has yet known. But those imaginations could also destroy you. Did we invent the sword rulers whom you so heroically fought?" "Aye," answered Coram, "I suspect that you did, and I suspect that you might invent others again." "Invent phantoms, fabulous beasts, powerful gods, whole cosmologies," said the astonished traveller. "Are all these things, then, unreal?" "They're real enough," Coram replied. "Reality, after all, is the easiest thing in the world to create. It is partly a question of need, partly a question of time, partly a question of circumstance." Coram had felt sorry for confounding his guest, and he laughed again and passed on to other topics. And so the years went by, and Ralina began to show signs of age, while Coram, near immortal, showed none. Yet still they loved each other, perhaps with greater intensity, as they realised that the day drew near when death would part her from him. Their life was sweet, their love was strong, they needed little but each other's company. And then she died, and Coram mourned for her. He mourned without the sadness which mortals have, which is, in part, sadness for themselves and fear of their own death. Some 70 years had passed since the sword rulers fell, and the travellers grew fewer and fewer as Coram of the Vadhag people became more of a legend in Luaminish than he was remembered as a creature of ordinary flesh. He had been amused when he had heard that in some country areas of that land there were now shrines to him, and crude images of him to which folk prayed as they had prayed to their gods. It had not taken them long to find new gods, and it was ironic that they should make one of the person who had helped rid them of their old ones. They magnified his feats, and, in so doing, simplified him as an individual. They attributed magical powers to him. They told stories of him which they had once told of their previous gods. Why was the truth never enough for the Mabden? Why must they forever embellish and obscure it? What a paradoxical people they were. Coram recalled his parting with his friend, Jari O'Connell, self-styled companioned champions, and the last words he had spoken to him. "New gods can always be created," he had said. Yet he had never guessed then from what at least one of those gods would be created. And, because he had become divine to so many, the people of Luaminish took to avoiding the headland on which stood ancient Castle Erorn, for they knew that gods had no time to listen to the silly talk of mortals. Thus, Coram grew lonelier still. He became reluctant to travel in Mabden lands, for this attitude of the folk made him uncomfortable. In Luaminish, those who had known him well, known that, save for his longer lifespan, he was as vulnerable as themselves, were now all dead too. So, there were none to deny the legends. And likewise, because he had grown used to Mabden ways and Mabden people about him, he found that he could not find much pleasure in the company of his own race, for they retained their remoteness, their inability to understand their situation, and would continue to do so until the Vadhag race perished for good. Coram envied them their lack of concern, for though he took no part in the affairs of the world, he still felt involved enough to speculate about the possible destiny of the various races. A kind of chess, which the Vadhag played, took up much of his time. He played against himself, using the pieces like arguments, testing one strain of logic against another. Brooding upon his various past conflicts, he doubted sometimes if they had ever taken place at all. He wondered if the portals to the 15 planes were closed forever now, even to the Vadhag and the Nadrag, who had once moved in and out of them so freely. If this was so, did it mean that effectively those other planes no longer existed? And thus his dangers, his fears, his discoveries slowly took on the quality of little more than abstractions. They became factors in an argument concerning the nature of time and identity, and after a while the argument itself ceased to interest Coram. Some 8 years were to pass since the fall of the Sword Rulers, before Coram's interest was to be reawakened in matters concerning the Mabden folk and their gods. The Chronicle of Coram and the Silver Hand.